Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and once again thank you kindly for stopping by. Just to remind you of the Mind Speak session with Christine Lagarde, that's uploaded onto YouTube and Rich TV. Do have a look for the link on the front page of the website or under Rich Wrap-Ups. I'll put up a photograph of Madame Lagarde, Vimal and myself. My home thoughts yesterday. I went to my Layla's parents' day and I enjoyed myself. Speaking to her English teacher, I learned, well, I knew already that Julius Caesar was her text, so I've been watching it because I wanted to sort of get her up a couple of grades on it. And I came across this quote, there is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune, omitted all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. What matters, now these are two quotes from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, what matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you remember it. And isn't that true, I think? Things have a life of their own, the gypsy proclaimed with a harsh accent. It's simply a matter of waking up their souls. Political reflections. China has condemned Japan's leader on his visit to Ethiopia. China's diplomatic assault on Japan's prime minister moved to another continent Wednesday as China's top official at the African Union called the Japanese leader a troublemaker just after his three-country visit to Africa. Abe's Africa trip follows his visit last month to a World War II shrine in Tokyo that China views as a memorial to war criminals who assaulted the Chinese people. Xi Zhaoyuan, China's ambassador to Ethiopia and its envoy to the African Union, said Abe's visit to the Yasukuni shrine was offensive, and he called the Prime Minister a troublemaker. The Chinese disdain for Abe's visit here went past the political level. On Sunday, Chinese activists brawled with Japanese embassy security in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, as they took pictures of the embassy protested Abe's visit. Chinese activists had collected signatures from among the thousands of Chinese nationals living in Ethiopia and tried to submit it to the embassy to protest at the shrine visit. Eyewitnesses in Addis Ababa told the AP that Chinese construction workers erected a sign or banner that said Senkaku Islands belong to us. The witnesses, who insisted on anonymity out of fear of reprisals, said the sign was taken down before Abe's convoy passed by. Abe on Tuesday told reporters that Japan is in Africa as part of his strategic diplomacy program. And I did say one of PM Abe Shinzo's objectives must have been to throw some sand in the eye of China. And evidently he has been successful in that regard. And as I said yesterday, I thought his language and his pitch for Japan Inc. was supremely effective. I'll put up that photograph of him dancing, joining a cultural dance in Ethiopia. I'll refer you to, and interestingly, they chose not to put it up on YouTube. I did an interview on CCTV News about this visit where I tried to be as balanced as possible. And just refer you to a piece I wrote on the 2nd of December 2013 where I was talking about the pivot to Asia bearing its fangs. And I said one of the key elements of the pivot to Asia is the air-sea battle concept. This concept envisages the battle beginning with a blinding attack against Chinese anti-access facilities and incorporates distant blockade operations. China's dependence on foreign oil is increasing, just as the US's dependency is decreasing. And interestingly, I've got the belief that the eastern seaboard of Africa is a fabulous energy prize, and that puts the Indian Ocean in many respects right into the geopolitical frame. And I said, if you're considering distant blockade operations, one of those areas you will be blockading is this part of the world, given the amount of energy that is likely to be sold into Asia in the future. And I think that was part of the reason he visited Mozambique. On that note, I'll put up a photograph of the snake by Ai Weiwei, which epitomizes the encirclement of China for me. And I came across this photograph of Abe Shinzo meeting Luis Nyaka at the Polana. He's the portman who's been there for about 3 decades and whom I met as well when I revisited in 2012. And I wrote a piece called The Polana Maputo, the Jewel of the Serena Hotels' Crown. I also put up a photograph of the sunrise as seen from my hotel suite. China apparently has for the first time tested a hypersonic missile vehicle designed to travel several times the speed of sound, according to the Pentagon. The test makes China the second country after the US to conduct experimental flights with hypersonic vehicles, a technology that could allow armies to rapidly strike distant targets anywhere around the world. The flight was conducted on the 9th of January. I'll put up a photograph of a new hypersonic glide vehicle. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad warned during a meeting in Damascus on Wednesday with Iran's foreign minister that Saudi Arabia's political and religious ideology is a threat to the world. And indeed, I'd agree with him. International Monetary Fund Managing Director Christine Lagarde urged policymakers in advanced economies to fight risks of deflation that would threaten a global recovery, she called feeble. Less than a week before the Washington-based fund releases its new global growth forecast, Lagarde said momentum in the second half of last year should strengthen in 2014 as developed economies gain pace. The fund plans to raise its forecast for the global economic expansion on January 21st. It remains below potential of about 4%, she said. Lagarde said that while the deep freeze is behind, world growth remains too low, too fragile, and too uneven. And then she's talking about how we should be creating 200 million more jobs. The world could create more jobs before we would need to worry about the global inflation genie coming out of its bottle. With inflation running below many central banks' target, we see rising risks of deflation, which could prove disastrous for the recovery. If inflation is the genie, then deflation is the ogre that must be fought decisively. We don't see the currency war clearly in our models. We see a much better alignment of currencies relative to fundamentals of the economies, she said. I'll put up a photograph of her on the live feed at Mindspeak. And also China apparently is urging the IMF to give more power to emerging markets. China called on IMF member nations on Wednesday to stick to a commitment to give emerging markets more power at the global lender after US lawmakers set back historic reforms that would give developing countries a greater say. The remarks by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman were an indirect criticism of the United States, the biggest and most powerful IMF member, where lawmakers failed on Monday to agree on funding measures needed for the reforms to move forward, though Hong did not mention the United States by name. Lagarde said it was disconcerting that the IMF funding was not included in a spending bill approved by the US Congress on Monday. I very much hope that it's a question of timing and not a decision to exclude the IMF, she said. The reform of the voting shares, known as quotas, cannot proceed without the United States, which holds the only controlling share of IMF votes. I'll put up a photograph of Hannah and Lagarde and myself. On that note, currency markets, Euro 136.20, dollar index firming up 80.95, got to get above 81. Japanese yen weaker at 104.74, and the yen has rallied sharply against the yen, about 1.8% over 2 sessions. Swissy 0.9084, pound 163.70. Aussie has fallen sharply 0.8814, slid 1.2%, touched 87.96, which was the weakest since August 2010. India rupee 61.575, South Korean won 10.64, a little bit of Weakness in some of the higher beta currencies. Real 236.08. They raised the benchmark rate to 10.5%. Egyptian pound 695.40. And the rand is at 10.89.80. And as I've been saying for a while, it's going to 11. Yen has fallen 13.7% in the past year. Aussie 14.8% over the same period. Euro plus 7.3%. Dollar plus 4.4%. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar index. It's continuing to strengthen. The Fed, in its Beige Book business survey released yesterday, said that growth in December was buoyed by gains in holiday spending by consumers, an improving labour market, and strength in manufacturing. Got to look at as it comes and tests the 2014 high. Euro dollar 136.20. I'll put up a 3-month chart of that, I reckon. My stop's at 133.80, and I'm going to stick with that. Dollar yen 104.74. I'll put up a 3-month chart of that. And, I had that target all last year, 105 to 110. I think about to enter that. Let's see how we move around once we get into that range. Aussie dollar, I'm going to put up a 1-year chart. And as you can see, that's at August 2010 lows and headed lower. Gold, 1242, I'll put up a 1-year chart. And just repeat that I think we'll see a $1,000 print this year. Crude oil had a strong rally yesterday, $94.36. Rose $1.58, and this was the highest close since January 2nd. I'm not buying into the bull story on oil this year, unless I see a substantial breakdown in the Iran-US rapprochement that we've been seeing of late. Uganda backing South Sudanese army in rebel fight, Museveni says to Bloomberg. Ugandan troops are helping South Sudanese forces recapture territory seized by rebels since fighting broke out in the country last month, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni said. The military of South Sudan are gaining on the ground, he said. They are advancing very well with the support of our troops. The conflicts in the DRC, South Sudan and CAR worry not just us in the region, but also Africa as a whole, he said. Reuters is carrying a report that UN troops fired warning shots to protect South Sudan compound. Are civilians seeking shelter in the Malakal base in Upper Nile State. One civilian was killed by bullets after gunfire entered the UN base there yesterday. Dozens of civilians and a UN military officer suffered gunshot wounds inside the base yesterday and received medical attention. So it remains fluid, remains volatile. I'll come to KCB's statement about affairs in South Sudan in a minute. The economy contracted, this is Uganda, by 0.6% quarter on quarter in July through September. This is by the Economist's Intelligence Unit. Real GDP shrank by 0.6% in the third quarter, a sudden deterioration following a strong performance in the first half of the year. The economy had been accelerating through until this latest quarter. Most of the decline in the third quarter was because of a 3.4% fall in agricultural output owing to erratic rainfall and drought conditions in some parts of the country. And they're not so bearish, saying that actually it's just a one-time event. They're saying we will maintain our current growth forecast of Uganda returning to its potential output growth of 7% in 2014, but we will revise this downwards if conflict in South Sudan is prolonged. Excuse me. Malawi is in the middle of a $100 million Cashgate scandal, bracing for the mass trial of 100 civil servants, politicians and business people involved in the alleged looting of more than $100 million from government coffers, a case that has become a litmus test for foreign donors backing the government of Joyce Banda. The Cashgate trial is scheduled to start on Wednesday under pressure from donors who bankroll 40% of the government's budget and have said they will withhold some aid until it is clear that it is not being misused. We are under extreme pressure to prosecute the cases, said Bruno Kalemba, the Director of Public Prosecutions. There are lots of files on my desk that need to be dealt with. There are warrants of arrest and a lot of follow-ups. This has become an emotional issue. The pressure for swift action has come from donors who have suspended pledged aid worth $150 million until Banda cleans up the mess of corruption and speedily prosecutes all suspects. Some political pundits are hoping that among the suspects, some will be bold enough to link the president to the public looting. Speculation about her involvement has been rife. Mufuyo is reported to have been on the verge of exposing a corruption ring when unknown gunmen shot him outside his home on September the 3rd. Billy Banda, director of Human Rights Malawi, said what Malawians can conclude is the president's hands are not clean in this issue. Somewhere and somehow the president's hands are there in this scandal. Chinoko said the looting was aimed at sponsoring the campaign of Banda's ruling People's Party, which was only formed a year ago with no national grassroots support ahead of May 20 local, national and presidential elections. So they're clearly very murky indeed. I think her finger has to be in that. It's either that or she's all hands off, not very on top of what's going on. So I think the implication is she knew. South African all shares up 0.46% in 2014, flipped into positive territory yesterday, rallied a percent. The DA gives Zuma an F for failing to lead South Africa. Millions of South Africans are worse off today than they were when President Zuma first came into office in 2009, she said. Dollar versus Rand, we're now moving towards that 11 mark. I'll put up a 1 month chart. We're going through 11 like a hot knife through butter. The Egyptian pound is at 695.52. An interesting report in Bloomberg saying when Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah held talks with Secretary of State John Kerry on November the 4th, his main concern wasn't US policy towards Iran's nuclear program or Syria's war, as the visitors had expected. It was Egypt. The Egyptian EGX30 has rebounded 45% since the army intervention. And one thing you can say is that the stock market loves Al-Sisi. The Egyptian stock market is up 6.13% this year and has just gone to 36 plus month highs. I wrote about this on the 30th of December when I said Africa remains in a sweet spot. And I said at the end of 2012, this rally has legs and further to go. I was talking about 2013, and I think that remains very much intact, and Africa remains in a sweet spot. The Nigerian all shares up 0.68% this year. The Ghana Stock Exchange Composite Index is up 1.71% so far in 2014. Zambia has appointed Deutsche Bank and Barclays as the joint financial advisors for a planned second Eurobond, senior finance ministry officials said on Wednesday. H&M shifts focus to African middle class. They've got production up and running in Ethiopia, and they're saying that Africa would be a key growth market as the middle class continues to swell. I think there is huge potential in Africa south of the Sahara when it comes to production. That is CEO Carl Johan Persson. We started production on a small scale in Ethiopia, and we'll see how it goes. It feels very interesting. Coming here to Kenya, Somali militants moving into Kenya, says an official. Dozens of foreign fighters have defected from the Al-Qaeda-linked militant group in Somalia due to internal disputes, and many of those men have moved into Kenya, security officials said. Al-Shabab, other militants, are under increased scrutiny in Kenya following the September 21st grenade and gunfire attack on Nairobi's Westgate Mall, an attack that killed at least 67 people. The trial of 4 suspects arrested in conjunction with the mall attack opened on Wednesday, and there's speculation that there's infighting between Al-Shabab leader Ahmed Abdi Godane and other top militant leaders who support the inclusion of foreign fighters in the group. Foreigners are now feeling mistreated and mistrusted, this official said. Matt Bryden, the former head of the United Nations Monitoring Group on Somalia and Eritrea and a top expert on Al-Shabaab, said the migration of foreign fighters into Kenya also includes Kenyan members of Al-Hijra, a Kenyan cell of Al-Shabaab sympathizers or fighters that Godana trusts. Even as that original crop of foreign fighters seems to be fleeing, other African recruits from countries like Tanzania and Uganda are heading to Somalia, said Musa Yego, the chief of criminal investigations in Kenya's Garissa County, which borders Somalia. And clearly, what's interesting was that development between the foreign fighters and Godani, the ban on the internet, and I think the foreign fighters in particular were very, very capable using the new internet ecosystem to get their message across. So that's interesting to keep an eye on. I'll put up a photograph of Westgate taken 114 days ago. Tullow Oil issued an operational update on the 15th of January. Oil discoveries at the Amasing 1 and Ewoy 1 exploration wells in Block 10BB. Tullow has updated its estimate of discovered resources in this basin to over 600 million barrels of oil equivalent, and are talking of it being in excess of 1 billion barrels of oil. Exploration results to date from the first basin amongst a chain of basins have proven that Tullow's onshore acreage in northern Kenya has the potential to become a significant new hydrocarbon province. And I wrote about this when I said e-money has happened, geothermal energy is happening, crude oil will happen, and are all contributing to quite an aphrodisiac. And I wrote that on the 23rd of July 2012. Tullow's CEO Aidan Heavey said, Kenya is one of our core and key areas going forward. Interestingly, talking about maybe doing a single pipeline, one pipeline network that covers their investment in Uganda, and also these finds in the northern part of Kenya. KCB, I'll put up a link for their share price data, refer to the fact that South Sudan was responsible for between 9 and 10% of profit before tax. They've issued a press release assuring customers and operations. The link is on Rich Wraps. Our commitment to the people in the nation of South Sudan has been demonstrated by the fact that most of the bank branches are operational and services being offered, with only 3 remaining closed in Bor, Bentiu and Malakal. This is the KCB South Sudan Board Chair Lady Charity Muya Gario. KCB has branches present in all the states and enjoys a market share of 50%, so that's even higher than what I was saying. It's well worth having a look at that statement. If you have a chance, have a look at an interview I did with Joshua about 4 weeks ago. Joshua being the CEO of KCB. Kengen targets 15 billion shillings in rights issue for growth. The state-owned power generator is seeking to raise cash to fund building of new power plants that will grow its installed capacity to 3,000 megawatts by 2018 from the current 1,239 megawatts. Kengen said it had set aside 2.21 billion new shares for existing shareholders for the cash call. That's a 30.6 billion cash call, nearly $500 million. And that's why I think we had that share price turn tail. It fell about 25%, then bounced since December 1st, then bounced over the last 2 sessions, 17%, but it's turning lower again because it's going to be very difficult to rally in the face of such a lot of supply. And it doesn't seem they're looking for a strategic investor right now, which means that this call is going to be made on the stock market. Kengen has rebounded 17.372% through this morning, but it's trading lower today. And I think that was a short covering bounce, which is now petering out. Put up a photograph of President Kibaki launching the old Carrier 4, which was one of their geothermal assets in the Rift Valley. The ICC has excused Kenya's deputy president from big parts of the Hague trial. That's a report on Reuters, and I think that's a concession to the African Union in particular. Kenyans talk for 7.4 billion minutes in 3 months. Total monthly minutes of usage increased by 1.5% to 79.6 minutes. That was versus 78.4 recorded in the previous year. Safaricom recorded the highest voice traffic at 5.9 billion minutes, followed by Airtel at 797 million minutes. Safaricom strengthened its grip on the SMS side, accounting for 95.6% of 5.2 billion SMSs sent during the period. Kenya shilling stronger, below 86 at 85.80. The Nairobi All Share up 3.19% this year. The NSE 20 up 2.67% this year. Strong session yesterday, up 0.71%. I did an interview where I sort of mentioned the fact that I thought if the stock market can hold above 5,000 on the NSE 20, that will be a bullish signifier. That interview was given to CNBC and is linked on on Rich Wrap-Ups if you care to have a look. The market is sort of twin-sided today. Obviously, Kenyan retreating after that strong bounce. Fargum, a little bit softer, but I think that's going to 1350. Once again, if you do want to track the stock market in real time, just register on rich.co.uk, get a password, it's all free, and go to Rich Live where you can see bid offer, you can see the size, demand, and it makes you a much more effective trader in the long run, I think. Once again, thank you for stopping by.